2015, I started going on long walks around Sheffield. This was before kids, when I had time to go on long walks. And on these long walks, I used to listen to podcasts. Never listened to podcasts before, but as soon as I started walking, I needed something to listen to on the move. So the first podcast I ever listened to, really, were On Being by Krista Tippett and Sean D'Souza's 3-month vacation podcast. I'd followed Sean's work for a few years. I listened to his presentation at the 2009 System Seminar, which is one of the first ever seminars on internet marketing. It's very obvious that Sean was both a storyteller but also a teacher. He's also, he's a polymath, but he's also able to explain things at a deep foundational level. And I've always had that sense about him. So I used to walk around Sheffield, sometimes in the rain, sometimes in the sun, listening to the early episodes of Sean's 3-month vacation podcast. On one of these episodes, Sean did an episode about storytelling and announced that he was going to do a 3-day storytelling workshop in Amsterdam. And I thought, well, I like Amsterdam. There's no real reason why I can't jump on a plane, go to Amsterdam and hang out for a few days. So I booked to go. So in December 2015, I flew over to Amsterdam. I've been binge listening to Sean's podcast on the flight over, trying to cram all of his insights into my head. Remember on the morning of the first day, I went down to breakfast at the hotel and I saw Sean and his wife, Renuka. They're having breakfast, talking about the slides, talking about things they might cover on that day. I thought about going to say hello and I thought, I'll leave them be for now. I'll just go and have my breakfast and I'll say hello at the event. I walked into the event 45 minutes later and I got talking to Sean. And one of the first things he said to me was, "So you're an introvert, right?" I was like, oh man, is it that obvious? I thought I tried to hide it. I thought I walked in with my extrovert armour on, trying to pretend I'm a sociable creature, and he saw through me straight away. It was very interesting. We got talking to the other events attendees. Most of us showed up as writers or storytellers in some capacity. Some of us were marketers and copywriters. Some of us were authors. But then there's a few other people as well. Remember, there was an engineer there who was just there just because he liked Sean's work and came to all of his events. So I walked into that workshop thinking that I already knew storytelling, and thinking that I might just pick up, 1 or 2 tips for sharpening the storytelling axe. And it became very clear to me that, in fact, we all make the same mistakes. And that storytelling wasn't the dark art, the gift of the gab that I thought it was. That we're all storytellers, but we'd all forgotten how to do it. We all made the same mistakes. And we all started telling stories and then making the story about too many things. Or not finishing the story on a clear one idea that would bridge into the message that we wanted to get across. Sean's process was first and foremost about research. One of the first things he covered at the event was that storytelling isn't about necessarily the telling, it's about the research. It's about pulling together all of the raw material that you might want to talk about, that you might want to work with. The workshop was really a full experience as well. It wasn't like Sean locked us into a room for 3 days and hammered, story craft into us. It was really an experience where we'd learn one thing, we'd go out into breakout groups, we'd talk between ourselves, we'd put it into practice, we'd work on a story, we'd verbalise a story to each other. At the end of each day, we'd have to reflect back to what we'd learnt across the day. And in the evening, we met up, we went out for food. Sean took us on a walking tour of Amsterdam, across all of the canals. This was just before Christmas, so there was a big light show out. It was cold, but not too cold. There were people sitting outside bars, under heaters. We went out for a few beers, not too many beers, but a few beers. At the end of the 3 days, we had a one-to-one with Sean, where we'd have to talk through present, if you like, a story that we've been working on across the 3 days that pulled together all the storytelling techniques that Sean had taught us. Sean had taught us about the timeline, about the one idea, about suspense and intrigue, about white space, having space in the story for the impact to land. So we had this one-to-one with Sean, and he'd listen very carefully. And he'd point out with this kind but interested expression. And he'd just reflect back to you. This is what I heard. This is what, to me, the story was about. Maybe you had too many points. Maybe the story was about multiple things. After the last day, most of the attendees hung out for a little bit. We shared a glass of wine. And I remember talking to the engineer. And the engineer, who had been in some of my breakout groups, he'd come out of his shell. He'd really arrived starting off thinking that storytelling wasn't his thing. And then he'd come out of his shell and he was telling stories that he was excited to go back to the office. He actually said, I can't wait to go back to work next week to put one of these stories to use and just get going, writing a story that I've been working on. Today's episode is the fourth of my core story prompts, and it's called The Key Insight. It's about picking out an event from your past that illustrates the biggest development in understanding, the biggest U-turn, if you like, that you've made on your topic. Unlike last week's prompt about self-understanding, the key insight comes from an external source. It might come from a mentor. In classical storytelling terms, the key insight comes from the muse, which is often like the father figure, the old man character, the Obi-Wan Kenobi type figure. But in real life, it doesn't have to be. And actually, since I've had kids, I've realised that the key insights are just as equally likely to come from your kids as they are to come from Obi-Wan Kenobi. Insights can come from anyone, at anywhere, at any time. It's a case of pinpointing, well, what's the key one? What's been the biggest U-turn in your opinions, beliefs, perspectives, ways of doing things? What's been the biggest turn? And what event triggered that key insight? What conversations triggered that insight? Where did you have to go to learn it? That's what the key insight prompt is all about. So the self-understanding prompt was very much focused on you, in terms of you being cracked open and learning something deep and foundational about yourself. The key insight prompt is you learning about your market, learning about the people that you're here to serve, learning about the ways that they think, the things that they're worried about, and the ways that you can best serve them. So as always, we're going to cover 3 ideas on this episode in thinking about this prompt and putting this prompt to use. The first idea is the surprise. The second idea is the experience. And the third idea is the U-turn, which kind of relates to clarity. So we'll get to that in due course. So let's go and have a look at the first idea. Life, I think, is a series of never-ending insights. If you're not receiving insights on a regular basis, then I would argue that you're walking around with your eyes closed. You're not speaking to interesting enough people. you're not trying hard enough. Every day is a school day in some respects. So the challenge of the key insight prompt is to pinpoint what are these insights across probably your professional developments. The first idea is that there should be a surprise element to it. And the surprise element could be in the circumstance of how you discovered the key insight, the source of the key insight. Did your key insight event come from your kids? Did it come from a source that you were not expecting? That could be one aspect to it. In my case, thinking about the story that I just told you about going to Sean's storytelling workshop in Amsterdam, in many regards, there's nothing surprising that is my key insight story. Like a self-stylized story consultant. Think about it. A self-stylized story consultant goes to a storytelling workshop in Amsterdam run by someone that he admires and discovers the key insight. Like, it's so archetypal, it's kind of depressing. So it wasn't a surprise to me that I picked up these insights from going to Sean's workshop. What was a surprise was the nature of the insights. You might remember from the telling that I was quite careful to mention the fact that I expected to just go and sharpen the storytelling axe. I expected to go and pretty much walk out with the same skills, walk out the same person as I walked in. So the surprise parts of the workshop were firstly discovering that yes, everyone is a verbal storyteller. Not all of us are written storytellers, I believe, but I truly believe that storytelling has a long verbal tradition. I think for as long as humans have been able to talk, we've been telling each other stories. We see the world through stories. We change the world through stories. So yes, stories matter. But what was so fascinating to me was that those of us who arrived at the event as storytellers or as professional or semi-professional storytellers in some capacity, we all made the same mistakes, especially telling verbal stories. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because writing is really my thing. I think by writing is my preferred mode of output. And yet, I insist on doing this crazy podcast where I talk to you one-on-one, which actually sort of activates all of my introvert tendencies. I think I've grown into it. I've forced myself to do it enough that I kind of like doing it now. I like speaking to you. Like, to me, we are in dialogue. Like, I am in conversation with you. Just because you can't talk back doesn't mean that we're not in conversation. And it really became clear to me at the events that we're all verbal storytellers. And the vast majority of us have forgotten how. Or we've never been taught how, is perhaps the point. I might argue that there's maybe an omission in our education system about how to tell stories and how to have confidence in our stories and how to foster a sense of internal knowing that your story matters, that your story has impact, that your story can make a difference. So we tend to think that story is this thing that gets tacked on, that we have our message, that we have our logic, so there's a lot of talk in marketing about storytelling, but I think a lot of it is just surface level, using it as a hack, as an attention grab, as a way to get more clicks. And that isn't really what I think is going on. So what I learned at Sean's event was that it didn't matter whether you were a professional or semi-professional storyteller or not. The story muscle for most of us had atrophied. We were out of the habit of telling stories. And not only that, what Sean's workshop did was it provided space to get live feedback on our stories as well. Both from Sean as the teacher, but also from other members of the group. And I'd say that everyone at that workshop learned as much from other members of the group, in both listening and then giving those other members feedback based on the principles that we'd just been learning in the course. We learned from each other and from the teacher. But it was that principle of feedback that allowed us to sharpen our skills. Because unless you get that feedback, it's very hard to... You can flex a storytelling muscle as much as you want. And it's like, yeah, if you go to the gym a lot, and if you lift a lot of weights, then yeah, okay, you're going to get stronger. But if you go to the gym and have a PT, a personal trainer, who's going to guide you, give you feedback, push you when you need to be pushed, tell you to stop lifting the heavy weights when you need to give yourself a rest. It's that level of feedback that really pushes you forwards. So it actually took a few years for the key insight for the penny to really drop for me what the key insight from Sean's event was. I always thought the insight was that we're all storytellers and we just need to learn the basics, learn the craft. I've since realised that we're all verbal storytellers. And this is why I do the podcast. Because, especially for all of my clients find it easier to talk than to write. So the talking comes first, the writing comes second. And the AI revolution has made it especially easy to get hold of the transcript of a podcast episode, or even just a voice note that you made to yourself. You just recorded a note on your phone for a few minutes of you talking. And again, the more you practice that muscle, the more you're going to get used to it, especially if you can get feedback on your storytelling. But most people find it easier to talk through stories than to write stories. Another reason I insist on doing this podcast, yes, is because my clients find it easier to talk than to write. So I have to walk that talk. I have to do it myself. But then there's been a few stories recently where I've gone to write them and just thought, you know what? I'm going to talk it first. I'm going to use the story in a podcast episode. Because there's more elements to a verbal story than a written story. There's a degree of tonality. If you're watching the video version, there's also an extra element of you seeing my facial expression, which is of debatable benefit, but it's still there. There's multiple levels to the communication. So everything has its place. I'm not saying that you should never write stories, especially in the first instance. But I'm saying that the use case for most people is to talk first, record first, get hold of the transcript, and then convert into the emails, blog posts, book chapters, written content that you're going to create to promote yourself and promote your work. And that was the big surprise learning for me from Sean's event. So in selecting your key insight story, have a think, where is the surprise in the story? There must be a surprise in the story. What is that surprise? The second idea to touch on today is the idea of the experience. So the key insight must have come to you through an experience. Nobody radically changes their opinion on anything, I believe, by staying at home, by working at their desk. No one receives a key insight by pushing harder at the grindstone. So the key insight story is likely to be a trip that you've made. It's likely to be a situation that you've put in that will have exposed you to different sorts of information than you would otherwise usually have experienced. I think there's something about travel as well that predisposes us to be more accepting of a key insight when it comes along, because we've been taken out of our natural habitat, so to speak, of our daily routine, the daily grind. The point about Sean's workshop was that it was first and foremost an experience. It was an experience more than a course, and it wouldn't have delivered the insights and the lessons that it did had it not been an experience. And since then, when I've run my own events, live events, I've tried to model that experience concept. I've not done it quite in the same way as Sean, but it's been an experience. And actually, anyone who's been on any of my events, the Big Story Workshop, or the Pie, Peas and Ads workshop, all of the delegates still talk about the experience to this date. And if you remember the experience, then you remember the lesson. So again, in selecting your key insight story, what was that experience? Third idea to touch on in the key insight is that there has to be a U-turn in understanding. Most of the insights that we get tend to just give us a bit more clarity, give us a bit more confidence in something that we already know in some regards. In preparing for this episode, I kind of thought that the storytelling workshop I went to in Amsterdam, that it was this more of a fractional insight, this kind of gaining of confidence in my internal knowing that storytelling mattered and that I could teach it and that the process worked. And in some regards it was, but there's also a U-turn in there. And the U-turn was about verbal storytelling. I went in thinking that I was just a writer, couldn't talk about stories, wasn't very good at talking about stories. This was before my podcasting journey began. so it's taken me a while to come to fruition on this. But the U-turn that I've come to is that stories are first and foremost a verbal technology, and that stories should be verbalized first, ideally to a live audience, where you get live feedback from people in the room. So just this week, I was running my story inspiration session for the 6-Star Leaders Group. So every month I do a 90-minute story inspiration call where I share a few stories, I break down the structure of those stories, and then I invite other people on the call to share stories that have come up for them. So it's a safe space. And one of the stories that I shared, I delivered the story, I got to the end of it, and I just felt that I'd lost the room a bit. It didn't quite have the impact that I thought it was going to have before I tested it out on a live audience. And this is why, so yeah, yes, I love writing, and yes, I love written output, but this is why I think verbalizing a story first, ideally to a live audience. I think podcasting is a second best, because you're still talking to an audience. It's just that it's not quite live. You have to gauge the feedback after you've published the episode. But you can still tell in verbalizing the story whether you feel it felt right or not. And if you have the live audience, then you get this very fast, are people paying rapt attention to you, or have you kind of lost them? And I just felt in one of the stories that I shared in the story inspiration call this week that, yeah, I wouldn't say I completely lost the room, but it didn't land how I thought it was going to land. Yeah, in some regards, this is what comedians do as well. They test out jokes on small audiences before they go out to the to the thousands attendee audience and reuse the same jokes. They test them out on small audiences first in a live setting so that you can see people's reactions. And I think that's a good thing to do with your stories as well. So that for me was the U-turn. It was going from writing first, my argument being that, thinking is writing, so write first, talk second. I've pretty much done a full U-turn on that now, which is why I still do the Story Systems podcast. It's as much as anything to keep flexing the story muscle, but it's also to verbalize the stories and see how they land for me, and hopefully for you, because I also gauge some feedback from the audience. But first and foremost, do they feel right to me in a delivery told verbally? Just in recap, there's actually a fourth idea I want to pass along to you about the key insight. And it's about chronological order. So if you're following along with the prompts, firstly we had the wounding event. The wounding event was an event from your past that started you on the journey to where you are today. So I talked about my stammering incidents at school. Prompt 2 was the full start, where you set out in business and your professional life and you seem to make good progress, but you're not acting as your true authentic self. So you go through these kind of full start events. So the full start prompt was prompt number 2. Those full starts culminate in the self-understanding events where you break down and you're broken open. We then have the key insight where you learn something from the marketplace. But actually, these events don't necessarily have to come in order. So for me, the key insight story, well, I went to Sean's workshop. So I already told you that was in December 2015. So it's just over 10 years ago. My key insight story happened before my self-understanding story, where I broke down at work. There's about a 3 years difference, actually, between those two stories. And the point is that it doesn't matter. Sometimes you're delivered the key insight story, and you know there's a key insight in it. But sometimes it just takes a bit of time for the penny to truly drop. And it wasn't necessarily that the penny dropped. It's just that as more time has passed, I've seen more gold in Sean's events and going to that workshop. In many regards, the key insight is a fork in the road story. It's a point on your timeline of events where you could have gone one way, but you went to this experience, you went to this thing, and you've gone the other. So it's a fork in the road. But the point I want to make here is that all of these prompts don't necessarily have to have happened in chronological order. It's most likely that the wounding event will have been from your childhood or earlier. It just is. It's just the nature of the prompt. But actually, the wounding event could happen at any time. The false start stories, again, they're most likely to have happened around your earlier iterations of work. But, I sometimes feel like my whole life is a false start story, if I'm being honest. And I think we all feel like that. Very tempting to look at all of these overnight success stories and think that we're the odd ones out with all of these false starts. But actually, the false starts are always ongoing because that's the nature of trying, testing, evolving, developing your presentation of who you are at your core essence. So the false start story could actually be a recent story as well. It doesn't have to be one from a long time ago. And then, as I just illustrated, the key insight being the external insight and the self-understanding being the internal understanding. Those two stories, chronologically on your timeline, it doesn't actually matter where they come from. So you've got a lot of flexibility here. I would tell the self-understanding story before the key insight, because the key insight is starting to move towards the solution. So the self-understanding is the pinnacle of the problem phase, where you're broken open, and then in the key insight you're moving forwards to seeing the solution, presenting the solution. But in the stories that you select to illustrate these points, it doesn't actually matter about the ordering of them. And hopefully that gives you a bit of flexibility in selecting these events to tell across your customer journey. In recap then, today's episode has been about the fourth of my core story prompts. That is the key insight. The key insight is an external market insight that you've learned, usually by going somewhere and experiencing something and speaking to people that you weren't expecting to speak to, or learning something that you weren't expecting to learn. So the first idea we covered was a surprise, was picking out a surprising element either about the insight itself or just around the circumstances in which it was delivered. The second idea we looked at was the concept of the experience, on the basis that key insights are delivered all day, every day, if you're paying attention, but the key insight should be an experience where you've left your day-to-day reality and you've put yourself in a different situation. The third idea we looked at was the U-turn, was that the key insight should actually U-turn, completely change your perspective on something that you, black and white, thought was nailed on. For a key insight to really have impact with your target audience, it should turn something that you held dear completely on its head. For me, that was the idea that writing should come first. And even for me, the ongoing recovering stammerer, it's about verbal storytelling first and foremost. What else is going on in my world? The first thing to say is that I actually recorded this episode yesterday. This is actually take 2 of the key insight. So I recorded this episode yesterday. I don't know if my energy was just off. I think especially for solo podcasting, I think if you're podcasting with a guest, you can usually pick up on the energy of the guest. You can drive each other forwards. I think for solo podcasting, like, you've got to be in the right space. Your energy's got to be right. And I just felt that my energy wasn't there. I had the kids buzzing around, asking for lunch, generally being distracting. And I just reflected back on it, and I wasn't happy with my delivery of the story. So if you ever deliver a story and you reflect back on it and you think, I just wasn't happy with the delivery of that, the takeaway isn't that you're not good at storytelling. The takeaway is that on that particular day, it was just a dry run. That telling of the story was just a dry run for a second draft that you're going to do, for a second take that you're going to do. So this is take 2. I think it's been a lot better. I always struggle in the moment to tell how I've done on the recording, but I think I really built on yesterday's first draft. So yeah, if you ever produce something, you're not happy with it, I would say that in podcasting, 80 to 90% of the time, you should just publish what you've produced. But then there's got to be a 10% to 20% of the time where if something doesn't feel right, you should just go back and do it again. And it's knowing when to publish in the 80% and when to redo in the 20%. I think the fact that this is one of my core story prompts, I just thought, I need to really get this right, because the transcript of this episode is going to be used in written formats. It's going to be used in a book update I'm going to do. It's going to go into a lead magnet that I'm going to create. So yeah, I just thought it was worth doing again. As I record this, it is the 2nd of February. So yesterday was Imbolc, was the Celtic festival of Imbolc, which is at the halfway point between winter solstice and spring equinox. So I try to have these dates on the calendar, and I try to mark them across the year so that every 6 weeks throughout the year, there's something to look forward to, there's something to pay attention to, something to give yourself, a few hours off for, and just mark in some small way. So I've been doing that over the last day or so as well. It also helps you to kind of get in tune with the natural rhythm of the seasons. It's quite easy in January, I think, when it's all dark and grey, to think that nothing's really happening. And then when you get to the 1st of February, at least in the UK, and you get this big energy change where things start to come back to life, the daffodils start to appear. And yeah, I for me, it's one of my favourite times of year, just because of the energy change and the lengthening of the days. So having said all that, as always, thank you very much for listening. Really appreciate you listening. If these episodes are helping, do feel free to get in touch with me. Head to storyrob.com and head to the contact page. I'd love to hear any feedback you've got on these episodes, or even if you put the prompts to use. I would love nothing more than for you to put these 5 core story episode prompts to use and work on your own story. I'd love to hear that. So do let me know. I'll speak to you next time about the 5th and final core story prompt, which is the vision. If you found this episode of Story Systems helpful, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. I'll send you a copy of my lead incubator system blueprint and also my top 5 core story prompts for entrepreneurs. Head to storyrob.com/podcast. You can also find my book by searching on Amazon for Simple Story Selling. See you next time.